Now let's talk about the vaccine candidate that is most likely to be distributed first. Following the recommendations of the FDA's advisory committee yesterday, we do anticipate the FDA could grant an EUA to the Pfizer vaccine as early as this weekend, and the medical system, therefore, could receive its first shipment by next week. So I think now would be a good time to introduce our special guest. Dr. Kirsten Lyke is a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Disease within the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She is also the principal investigator on the clinical trial studying the Pfizer vaccine. Dr. Lyke, thank you so much for taking time joining us today. And to start, I was hoping we could take a step back and just hear a little bit about how all of this started.
Thanks, Dr. Sinta. And I want to thank both you and Dr. Marcosi for inviting me here today, and also to recognize all the medical care members that are out there. I know we've been in the trenches and we're all tired, but it's a pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about what might be a ray of sunshine, I think, in this pandemic. So the University of Maryland School of Medicine is a known global leader in vaccine development, particularly at the Center for Vaccine Development, which is led by Dr. Kathleen Newsel, who's a respiratory specialist. And as such, she sits as the co-chair for the Vaccine Efficacy Group on the National COVID-19 Prevention Network. So we were actually the first institution that Pfizer approached about participating in the clinical trial for their vaccines. This was back in early April. And at that point, they had joined forces with a small German company called BioNTech and had already been working for almost 2 months in prepping and beginning plans for vaccine development soon after the first cases were reported.
Dr. Lyke, Dr. Marcosi, I wonder, can you walk us through how the trial works? Were you just testing one vaccine, or were you looking at multiple candidates?
Yeah, so this is very different than the timeline of traditional vaccines. Typically, we work through a phase 1, 2, 3 system. It may take 15 or 20 years. Our work really begins with what's known as a phase 1 clinical trial. By the time it gets to phase 1, it's usually been tested in a laboratory and in animals for safety and effectiveness. Obviously, that was abbreviated for this COVID-19 vaccine, but it had been in mice and had been studied in the Petri dish. So our job is to take the finalists that the companies give us and compare them head to head. Usually we do it one by one, and each study may take 18 months. And we'll do a careful analysis before we move to the next one. But in this case, we're cutting a lot of the administrative portions of trials down. And instead of doing them one by one, we basically put 5 different vaccines at the starting line and began them all concurrently. So we actually had starting with 4 and then added a 5th different vaccine with multiple doses from Pfizer that we began working on. We vaccinated our first individual 2 to 3 weeks after we were approached. So May 4th, and the University of Maryland was the very first institution to vaccinate individuals. Usually by phase 1, we already know that the vaccines are safe based on previous trials, and we're looking for formula and dosage that provide the highest level of protection and the lowest level of side effects. So that's what we're looking at when we're testing different formulations and different doses. So after we went through the pipeline, which took us May, June, and into the early part of July, we had one recommended candidate, which we call the B2 candidate, which we recommended would move into phase 3 clinical trials. The phase 3 clinical trials involved 44,000 people, and it was a 1-to-1 design. So 22,000 people got the vaccine and 22,000 people got the placebo, but we were blinded and neither the investigators nor the volunteers knew what they got. The Pfizer vaccine candidate that is currently under review, or actually was reviewed by the VRBPAC committee yesterday, is the one that our team found to have excellent immunologic response and was, more importantly, the best tolerated of the constructs that we examined.
So, Dr. Lyke, speaking
Yeah,
of
thanks.
side effects, we've heard a lot of different reports about what we can expect related to vaccines and side effects. Can you shed some light on this?
Yes, it's of course a little confusing because, as I've mentioned, there's a lot in the news on multiple vaccine candidates throughout all the trials and from different manufacturers. So many of the reports from early candidates that did not get taken into phase 3 study may have reported more reactogenicity, more side effects than the current ones that went into phase 3. So you're probably hearing conflicting reports, and it's difficult to sort of sort through where the truth is. But I can tell you firsthand that the vaccine that moved forward for EUA approval by the FDA is consistent with what the FDA and what has been published in the last few days. So we know absolutely that people will experience side effects, but in broad swaths, they're minor and self-limited. So you may experience things like slight discomfort at the site of injection, much like when you get a flu shot. In fact, about 2/3 of people reported some discomfort at the site where they received the injection. The second most common side effect was fatigue, and about half of people experienced some fatigue, some low-grade muscle pain or headaches. And probably the most severe side effect was actually a true fever or even minor chills. Now, all of these side effects were expected. The volunteers were advised that this could occur, and they all dissipated very quickly so that they were gone within 24 to 48 hours. And in fact, sort of a unique aspect that I have noticed is that it's almost like a light switch. Many of the volunteers will say that they felt some mild body aches or mild chills, and the effects went away like a light switch went off after about 30 hours.
Dr. Lyke, I wonder if we could follow up a little bit about what do those side effects indicate? It always seems there's some discussion about people being able to contract a virus from a vaccine. I think in large part because when they get a vaccine, they experience symptoms that are consistent with what you're describing here. Can you explain what's going on inside the body?
Yeah, it can be confusing, but let me start out by saying that, number one, you cannot get COVID-19 from this vaccine. It's scientifically impossible. It does not have the components of the virus to be able to do that. You might experience side effects after being vaccinated, and it may make you feel like you're coming down with an early form of the flu. And in fact, exhibiting side effects is actually a sign that your immune system is kicking in and that the vaccine is working. So when we get a vaccine, our immune system is trained to recognize a potential infection. And that triggers special cells to seek out and fight what's perceived to be this infection. And then these cells will send out signals to produce antibodies or special proteins, which act as an immune response to protect our body from future infections. So in the case of the Pfizer and also the upcoming Moderna trials, vaccines, which we also performed here at the University of Maryland, we are using something called messenger RNA technology. So we are essentially instructing our cells as though it was a bit of computer code. We're telling our cells to create a spike protein. We all use mRNA. Our cells use it every day. We can tell it whatever protein we want to make. But in this case, we're telling our cells to create the spike protein, which is found on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We're not using any part of the virus itself to trigger that immune response. So that being said, if you don't experience side effects, it doesn't mean that the vaccine didn't work. Individuals have different responses. As I said, a third to a half had zero symptoms. So whether or not you have symptoms, rest assured the vaccine is still doing what it needs to do, and it's effective in these people. Now, you may have heard in the news that there have been 2 instances of anaphylactoid-like reactions that occurred in the UK. In rare instances, people with a history of severe allergies. And in these 2 described events, they were people with severe allergies to the point that they carried EpiPens on hand at all time. You may see when we're vaccinating large swaths of the population, very rare allergies. It's not uncommon for vaccines. We will follow the FDA guidance on this and certainly recommend that people consult their physician before getting vaccinated if you have concerns, or in particular, if you are a person that has severe allergies. But I would point out that unlike the flu vaccine, there are no components of egg within the mRNA vaccine. So people who have egg allergies do not need to be concerned that they will have an allergic reaction to the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines.
So thanks, Dr. Lyke. And, I myself am amazed at the level of interest that many in our communities have about the actual science behind the vaccine development. And specifically, the conversation around mRNA technology and the fact that it's new. People know that it's new, but that often raises a question of, was it safe? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this technology and why it is in fact safe.
Yeah, you're exactly right that the public is very savvy on the nuances of vaccine development, which is fantastic. Now, mRNA is new in the sense that it's the first time it's been brought to market, and it's something that researchers have been working closely on for more than a decade. In particular, it's been tested as a cancer vaccine. So it's been in people who are immunosuppressed and in fact was developed for that line of science. Now, the mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 contain a bit of code, essentially like a computer code, and that instructs our cells to make the spike protein, as I said previously. That's going to trigger an immune response in our bodies. But one thing about mRNA is it's meant to act within our cells. It's not very stable. So we have to provide it with a vessel that enables it to get through the bloodstream and into the cells. And the technology that goes into this is essentially constructing little bubbles of fat. We call them lipid nanoparticles. The Pfizer vaccine actually has 4 different lipid nanoparticles that form a cocoon around the mRNA, and they act like a shuttle to basically carry the mRNA into the cell. That's one of the reasons that the cold chain is so important for many of these vaccines, particularly the Pfizer vaccine. So the mRNA, once it reaches the cell, it essentially teaches our cells to produce harmless spike protein. And in response, the cell will produce a protein and trigger an antibody response by our body, who thinks it's seeing the spike protein of COVID-19, but in reality is just seeing a very small component. So after that process is complete and we've trained our immune system to recognize the spike protein, it should protect against future infection without ever having to introduce the live virus into our body. So mRNA vaccines will never affect or interact with your genetic code. They do not intercalate into the DNA. In fact, they merely disintegrate. It's a little bit of code, a little bit of instruction. it will completely disintegrate and break down within the cell within days and be removed from our bodies entirely.
Thanks for that background, Dr. Lyke. Appreciate it. I'm going to pivot right back to side effects just for one more question on this. If our workforce experiences, side effects that you described earlier that are consistent with COVID, what should they do?
Yeah, this is going to be a little confusing for some people because, of course, we've said that people experiencing any COVID-related symptoms should stay home at this point. We know that the vaccine is likely to cause side effects. We need to ask people to closely monitor those side effects and the window in time after which they've been vaccinated. So we know that most of the symptoms are going to be mild and that they should dissipate very quickly, normally within 24 to 48 hours. You should return to work if it's within 36 hours of receiving either dose 1 or dose 2. I might mention that dose 2 might have more side effects than dose 1. But you are able to return to work if you're experiencing only mild to moderate side effects that are clearly linked to the vaccine. Now, if you are experiencing symptoms that are not consistent with a vaccine, so if you're within that 24 to 48 hour window after which you've gotten a vaccine, and you experience symptoms such as a new loss of taste or smell, a new cough, a new episode of shortness of breath or sore throat, if you have symptoms that are symptomatic of COVID-19 and not the vaccine, then you should hold off, not report to work, and call employee health. Also, if you have symptoms that are extending beyond that 36-hour to 48-hour window since you received the vaccine, and they're either not improving or perhaps even getting worse, and that could include fever, chills, or COVID-like symptoms such as cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, new loss of taste or smell. In those cases, we absolutely recommend that you call employee health hotline, follow existing policy, and get a COVID-19 test. So just to repeat, known symptoms for 24 to 48 hours. If you're having atypical symptoms that are more consistent with COVID, even if it's within that 36-hour window, you should not return to work and you should call employee health. And if the symptoms are lasting for a prolonged period or include COVID-19-like symptoms, call the employee health hotline and get a COVID-19 test.
So, Dr. Lyke, can I ask you, again, a lot of conversation in public about should pregnant women and children take the vaccine?
Yes, good point. Yeah. Okay, so for all of these trials, we typically start with our healthiest and move on to other populations. So in this case, we started with young people and moved to older people and then de-escalated down to 12-year-olds. Now, as is typical, we do not normally include pregnant women first, and we don't typically study pregnant women and children in the early studies. Now, we do have imminent studies that are going to be examining pregnant women and children under the age of 12. But at this point, the data that was presented for review for EUA only includes 16 years and older. Now, the ACIP of the CDC that advises the CDC has suggested that this vaccine should be safe in pregnant women. And in fact, personally, I feel that it's going to be safe. But of course, we'd recommend assessing your individual risk and consulting with your physician when you make those important decisions. Children will not be vaccinated at this time point until additional studies are being done, and that will occur as early as late January, maybe into February. And many of the vaccine manufacturers are moving into the pediatric population.
Okay, good to know, Dr. Lyke. I'm going to just jump about some other specific, another question on some different groups. Can you talk a little bit about how how this vaccine affects different demographics in different ways, or if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that we were very cognizant of the fact that there are populations that are have enhanced vulnerability, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's poverty, whether it's underlying medical conditions. And we really did strive to include those high-risk populations in our phase 3 efficacy studies to assure people that this not only was safe, but that we were getting adequate immune responses in these populations. So in the 44,000 volunteers that participated in the Pfizer study, 41% were older than 56 years of age. About 26% were Hispanic Latinx, 10% African American, 5% Asian, and 1% Native American. And we found that overall, there was a 95% vaccine efficacy in the entire group, and splitting it up between younger and older, there was a 94% efficacy in the older population. So while COVID-19 may affect different groups disproportionately, the vaccine appears to be almost equally effective in all the populations that we examined.
So thank you for that, Dr. Lyke. And that is just such critical information for us to be able to communicate across all of our communities. And because we have to obviously let science speak as people make their decisions. So I know there's also been a lot of questions regarding immunity and transmission. Can you help us understand the difference between the two and what we need to keep in mind as we think through this issue?
This is critical. So we broke the blinding to examine the vaccine protection. And protection was defined as 2 weeks following the second dose. That means 2 weeks after you receive your second dose, if you were to be exposed to COVID-19, that you had a very good chance of being protected. What we have learned is that there is some immunity that develops even after the first dose, but the second dose is critical. However, even though you may individually be protected against the COVID-19 virus, we do not know if you can carry the vaccine in your nasal or carry the virus in your nasal passages. And there is a potential that you could be protected and have immunity, but still be able to transmit the virus. Our studies were not designed to determine if or how well they stop transmission of the virus. We can get a flavor for that with some of the data. But regardless of whether you're in the first vaccine or the second critical vaccination process, it's very important that you maintain social distancing practices, wear your PPE, wear your mask, and continue doing so for the duration of the pandemic.
Dr. Lyke, we're all tired of COVID. So what do we need to do to end this for good?
Yeah, I'm tired of it as well. I'm sure you've heard this and you've probably seen some of the cartoons, but it's an excellent analogy that this vaccine is just one important tool. And I kind of think of it like a piece of Swiss cheese. So the vaccine itself, nothing is 100%. It is very good. But if you stack together, say, a layer of PPE or a mask as another piece of Swiss cheese, then social distancing, then self-quarantining as much as possible, refraining from going outside. When you stack each of these intervention measures, each of which is not perfect, but when you put them all together, it's a solid piece of protection. And that's how we should look at this. Vaccine is just one tool. So it's important to not let your guard down. We're going to get through this. We have to get the vaccine distributed to our entire population and, in fact, the rest of the world as well. So we need to not let our guard down. We need to continue wearing masks. We need to wear our PPE, continue practicing good social distancing, and continue to follow our infection prevention guidelines. But I would say that this is a light at the end of the tunnel. We just can't let our guard down yet.
Thank you, Dr. Lyke. And as you said it eloquently, there is indeed light at the end of the tunnel. However, we all recognize that we can't let our guard down just yet.